History holds secrets that challenge everything we think we know about the human mind. Deep in the forgotten corners of ancient civilizations, people performed ceremonies so strange they seemed to defy all logic. These were not simple traditions. They were lost rituals, elaborate acts where the line between reality and the supernatural completely blurred. We are about to explore 25 of the most bizarre examples ever documented. You will witness ceremonies of voluntary mummification, frenzied dances of mass hysteria, and sacrifices that sustain the cosmos itself. By the end of this journey, you will understand the extreme lengths humans have gone to in their search for meaning and power. What hidden part of human nature do you think drives people to such extraordinary acts? The first of these lost rituals is also one of history's most profound secrets. For nearly 2,000 years, a ceremony known as the Eleusinian Mysteries unfolded annually in the ancient Greek town of Eleusis. This was not a public festival. It was a deeply personal initiation dedicated to the goddesses Demeter and Persephone, and its true nature was guarded with a terrifying intensity. Every single initiate was sworn to secrecy under penalty of death, a vow so effective that the core of the ritual remains a complete blank in our historical record to this day. We know the framework, the grand processions from Athens, the purification in the sea, but the climax, the events inside the great hall called the Telesterion, is a mystery we can only piece together from whispers and clues. The most compelling theory suggests the participants drank a special potion called kykeon. This was not an ordinary beverage. Scholars believe it could have been a powerful psychoactive brew, perhaps derived from a fungus like ergot, which would have plunged the initiates into a state of profound waking vision. They would have experienced the myth of Persephone not as a story to be heard, but as a reality to be lived. Imagine the darkness of the hall shattered by dramatic reenactments, blinding light, and sacred objects revealed, all while under the influence of a substance that made the divine feel tangibly present. The impact of this experience was reportedly life-altering. Those who emerged from the Telesterion claimed to have been transformed, to have gazed upon the secrets of life and death itself, and to have lost all fear of dying. This was not mere entertainment. It was a ritual so powerful that it offered a glimpse of the afterlife, and its secret was kept successfully for 2 millennia. That promise of transcending death through a sacred ritual stands in stark contrast to another practice, one where the boundary between life and death was not just crossed but systematically erased. In the mountains of Japan, a school of Buddhism known as Shingon gave rise to one of the most extreme rituals ever conceived, the pursuit of becoming a sokushinbutsu, a living Buddha. This was not a metaphorical title. It described a monk who had achieved the ultimate state of enlightenment by turning his own living body into a permanent, incorruptible mummy. The process was a grueling test of endurance that unfolded over years, a self-directed march toward a very specific kind of death. It began with a phase known as the 1,000-day tree-eating diet. For nearly 3 years, the monk would survive on a starvation regimen of nuts, seeds, and berries, deliberately stripping every ounce of fat from his body. This was the first and most crucial step because fat is what causes a body to decompose rapidly. By removing it, the monk was preparing his physical form for its final state. The next 1,000-day phase was even more severe. His diet shifted to only bark, roots, and a special poisonous tea brewed from the sap of the yorushi tree. This sap is the same substance used to create lacquer for furniture, and it is intensely toxic. Drinking it caused violent vomiting, sweating, and a profound loss of bodily fluids, further desiccating the tissues. More importantly, it saturated the body with poison, making it a hostile environment for the maggots and bacteria that would normally consume a corpse. After these 2,000 days of brutal preparation, the final act began. The monk, now emaciated and poisoned, would enter a small stone tomb barely larger than his body. He would settle into the lotus meditation position, and his attendants would seal the stone door shut, leaving only a small air tube and a single bell with a string leading inside. Each day, the monk would ring the bell to signal he was still alive, meditating in the utter darkness. When the bell finally fell silent, the attendants would wait one more day, then remove the air tube and completely seal the tomb. They would then leave him there undisturbed for another 1,000 days. Only after this final long vigil would the tomb be unsealed. If the body was found perfectly preserved, not decayed, the monk was declared a true sokushinbutsu, a Buddha in the flesh, and was enshrined as an object of veneration. This was the ultimate act of will, a belief that enlightenment could be so powerfully achieved that it would physically transform the body into a sacred relic, a permanent guide for the living. While the sokushinbutsu sought enlightenment through stillness and denial, the rituals of the Roman goddess Cybele demanded a far more violent and public transformation. The Romans called her the Great Mother, and the festival held in her honor, the Hilaria, was a week-long explosion of chaos that culminated in a day of absolute frenzy known as the Day of Blood. This was not a somber ceremony. The streets of Rome would pulse with the frantic rhythm of drums, the shriek of flutes, and the wild, spinning dances of her devotees. The music was designed to shatter normal consciousness, to whip participants into a collective ecstasy where pain and reason no longer held any meaning. At the center of this storm were the Galli, the priests of Cybele. In a final, terrifying act of devotion, these men would reach the peak of their frenzy and perform the ultimate sacrifice upon their own bodies. Using sharpened flints or broken shards of pottery, they would publicly castrate themselves. The logic behind this act is almost impossible for the modern mind to grasp. It was a complete and violent rejection of the physical world and their own masculinity, a direct offering of their fertility to the goddess, but the ritual did not end with the act itself. Bleeding and in a state of shock, the new priest would then run through the streets, hurling the severed flesh into the doorway of a random house. According to the strange rules of this tradition, the family living there was then obligated to honor him. They had to provide the self-made eunuch with elaborate women's clothing and fine jewelry, effectively outfitting him for his new life as a living symbol of devotion that transcended gender. To willingly embrace such mutilation, to exchange one's identity for a lifetime of service, seems like the height of madness. Yet for the Galli, it was the ultimate expression of faith, a brutal, logic-defying gateway to the divine. From the chaotic streets of Rome, we travel north to the stark and frozen shores of the Viking world, where a different kind of ritual sacrifice held a terrifying power. This was the blood eagle, a form of execution so brutal its very existence is debated by historians to this day. According to the sagas, this was not a punishment for common criminals. It was a sacrifice reserved for high-status captives, a gruesome offering made to the god Odin himself, the All-Father who hung upon the world tree for 9 nights to gain wisdom. The process was a meticulously cruel art. The victim was placed face down, utterly restrained. With a sharp blade, the executioner would cut deep along the spine, severing the ribs from their vertebral anchor. Then, with immense force, the ribs were pried outward and broken, splayed to either side like the massive, bony wings of a great bird. But the ritual's most chilling detail was still to come. The lungs, the organs of breath and life, were then carefully extracted from the ravaged cavity and draped over the splayed ribs. In the cold air, the victim's final, agonizing breaths would cause the lungs to flutter and twitch upon the ribcage, creating a horrifying, macabre imitation of an eagle in flight. This was the blood eagle's ultimate symbolic purpose. It was a direct offering to Odin, whose animal familiars included the eagle and the wolf, creatures of the battlefield. The question of whether this was a literal, historical practice or a later literary invention by Christian writers to demonize the Norse pagans is a fierce academic debate. Yet its power endures. Whether real or a terrifying legend, the blood eagle perfectly encapsulates a worldview where the gods demanded the most extreme sacrifices, and where a warrior's death was not an end but a transaction with the divine, written in a language of pain that defies all modern logic. The sheer brutality of the blood eagle finds a strange echo in another ancient account of fire and sacrifice. Across the sea in Gaul, Roman legions reported a ritual so chilling it has haunted the Western imagination for 2,000 years. Julius Caesar himself wrote of the Druids and their most terrifying practice, the creation of a wicker man. This was no small effigy. The Romans described a colossal, hollow statue woven from willow and other pliable woods, crafted into the form of a giant human. Its scale was immense, large enough to hold a small crowd of people inside its cage-like body. According to these accounts, the Druids would fill this giant wicker cage with living victims, often prisoners of war, convicted criminals, or even volunteers. Then, with the victims trapped inside, they would set the entire structure ablaze. The wicker man would become a towering inferno, a screaming pyre offered to the Celtic gods. The logic behind such a horrific spectacle was likely rooted in a belief in reciprocal exchange. The gods controlled the fertility of the land and the outcome of battles. In return for a bountiful harvest or a decisive victory, the community had to offer something of immense value, the ultimate gift of human life, multiplied many times over in a single, theatrical act of destruction. Yet, modern historians look upon Caesar's description with deep suspicion. He had a powerful motive to portray the Celtic tribes as monstrous barbarians, thereby justifying his own brutal conquest of their land. This could very well have been the ultimate piece of Roman propaganda. However, archaeology adds a complicating layer. Evidence from Celtic sites does show signs of ritual burning and, in very rare cases, possible human sacrifice, though nothing on the scale of a giant wicker statue. So we are left with an unsettling question. Was the wicker man a real, practiced ritual or a terrifying story invented by a conquering general? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. The power of the image itself is undeniable. It represents a concept of sacrifice so vast and impersonal that it defies our modern moral compass, a belief system where the needs of the many completely overrode the lives of the few, all enacted in a spectacle of fire and agony. The flames of sacrifice took on a profoundly different meaning in the ancient traditions of India, where a funeral pyre could become the stage for a woman's final and most celebrated act. This was the practice of sati, a ritual where a widow would voluntarily ascend her husband's funeral pyre and end her own life in the flames. The very word sati means a virtuous woman, one who is true and chaste, and this final act was seen as the ultimate expression of that virtue. It was not viewed as a simple suicide, but as a sacred duty with profound spiritual consequences. The belief was that this supreme sacrifice would purify both the husband and wife of all accumulated sin, ensuring they would be reunited for 14 generations in the afterlife. Beyond this spiritual guarantee, it was also thought that a sati's act would bring divine blessings, prosperity, and protection to her entire family and village. The site where a sati occurred was often marked by a temple, becoming a place of pilgrimage and reverence. Yet, to understand this ritual is to confront a deeply unsettling paradox. How could self-immolation be framed not as a tragedy, but as the highest honor a woman could achieve? The answer lies in the crushing social and economic realities that surrounded widowhood. In the rigid structure of traditional society, a widow was often considered inauspicious, a financial burden on her husband's family, and stripped of all social status. She was expected to live a life of severe austerity, shaving her head, wearing plain white clothes, and surviving on a single meal a day. For many, this life was seen as a form of social death, a prolonged and miserable existence. Within this context, the choice to perform sati was not made in a vacuum. While some women may have genuinely believed in the spiritual rewards, many others faced immense, often unspoken, pressure from their families and community. To become a sati was to transform oneself from a burden into a saint, to exchange a life of hardship for eternal glory. The British colonial administration, horrified by the practice, eventually outlawed it in the early 19th century, but the cultural echoes remain. This ritual defies all modern logic because it represents a world where a woman's ultimate value was so deeply tied to her husband's existence that her own life could be willingly, and even celebratedly, extinguished in the name of duty, devotion, and a promise of paradise. The logic of sacrifice as a cosmic necessity reached its most chilling and monumental form in the heart of the Aztec Empire. Here, towering over the great ceremonial plazas, stood the Tezcatlipoca, a structure designed to strike awe and terror into any who saw it. These were not simple displays of power, but immense wooden racks meticulously constructed to hold thousands of human skulls, all facing outward in a silent, skeletal audience. The sheer scale is almost incomprehensible, with recent archaeological excavations at the main temple in Tenochtitlan uncovering a rack holding the remains of many thousands of individuals. But to dismiss these as mere trophies of war is to miss their profound, and to the Aztecs, utterly vital purpose. Each skull represented a life given not in spite of the gods, but for them. The Aztec cosmos was a fragile, precarious place, balanced on the edge of perpetual chaos. They believed the sun god, Huitzilopochtli, fought a daily battle against the endless night, and he was desperately weak from the struggle. The only substance that could nourish him and give him the strength to rise each morning was Chalchihuath, the sacred, life-giving energy found in human blood. Without a constant supply of this divine fuel, the sun would fail, the world would be plunged into eternal darkness, and all of creation would cease to exist. This was the core logic that defies our modern sensibilities. For the Aztecs, ritual human sacrifice was not an act of cruelty, it was an act of cosmic preservation. It was the ultimate form of recycling, where a human life, the most valuable offering possible, was transformed into the energy that sustained the universe. The Tezcatlipoca was the public record of this sacred transaction. It was a gruesome ledger, a stone and bone accounting system that proved to the people and to the gods that the necessary work was being done. Every skull pierced on those wooden stakes was a receipt for a prayer answered, a guarantee that the sun would indeed rise again. Yet even the rigid cosmic order of the Aztec world has a strange parallel in a ritual that celebrated pure chaos. In the shadowy forests of ancient Greece and later in the very heart of Rome, the worship of the god Dionysus offered a temporary but total escape from societal bonds. His followers did not seek to preserve the universe but to shatter their own identities in a nightly rebellion. These were the Bacchanalia, rites of such intense ecstasy that they were considered a direct threat to the Roman Republic itself. The core participants were often women, known as maenads, who would abandon their homes and families to gather on dark mountainsides. Their worship was a sensory overload, driven by the relentless beat of drums and the sharp call of flutes, music designed to dismantle reason. They drank wine in vast quantities, not for simple pleasure, but as a sacred act, believing the grape's intoxicating power was the literal essence of the god. In this heightened state, they would dance with a savage, uncontrollable energy, whipping themselves into a collective frenzy. The climax of this ritual was an act that defied all civilized norms, the omophagia. In their trance, the maenads would seize a live animal, often a goat or a bull, and using only their bare hands and teeth, they would tear it apart. They would then consume the raw, bleeding flesh. This was not an act of hunger, but of profound symbolism. They believed that in devouring the animal, they were consuming the god himself, taking his wild, untamable power into their own bodies. This was the goal, a state called enthusiasmos, which literally means having the god within you. In that moment, the worshipper lost all sense of self, becoming one with the primal force of nature, liberated from every law and custom that defined their daily lives. This promise of total freedom is what so terrified the Roman Senate. When the Bacchanalia spread to Italy, the state saw not piety but madness. They saw secret nocturnal meetings where social hierarchies dissolved, where slaves and aristocrats mingled as equals in the darkness, and where the normal rules of behavior were cast aside. The Senate believed these gatherings were hotbeds of every crime imaginable, from political conspiracy to murder. In 186 BCE, they issued a devastating decree suppressing the cult with brutal force. Thousands of its followers were arrested and executed. The state had recognized a profound truth, that a ritual offering absolute liberation is perhaps the most dangerous power of all. The roar of the crowd did not fill a stadium for mere entertainment, but a sacred arena for a deadly cosmic drama. Across the jungles of Mesoamerica, the Maya built massive stone ball courts, their towering, sloped walls framing a space where a game called paganpractices was played. This was no simple pastime. It was a brutal physical contest steeped in profound spiritual meaning, a ritual where the final whistle could mean a beheading. The game itself was an incredible feat of athleticism. Players, often weighed down with heavy protective padding, could not use their hands or feet. Their entire bodies became instruments to keep a solid rubber ball, weighing as much as a modern bowling ball, in constant motion. Using only their hips, elbows, and knees, they had to propel this heavy sphere through stone rings high on the court walls or keep it from touching the ground. The physical punishment was immense, with broken bones and severe bruising being a common part of every match, but the true weight of the game lay in its symbolism. Paganpractices was a reenactment of the Maya creation myth, specifically the story of the hero twins who outwitted the gods of the underworld in a ball game. The court represented the universe, the ball was the sun moving through the sky, and the players were the heroes battling the forces of darkness. This cosmic symbolism meant the outcome of the game had real-world consequences, tied to the cycles of the sun and the very stability of the world. And this is where the ritual takes its most chilling turn. While the common belief is that the losing captain was sacrificed, some interpretations suggest that in certain circumstances, it was the winning captain who offered his life. The logic is perversely beautiful. To win the game was to embody the victorious hero twin, and what greater honor could there be than to immediately offer that triumphant life to the gods, replicating the twins' own journey and eventual apotheosis. The sacrifice was typically a swift decapitation. In a final, grisly twist, the severed head of the captain was sometimes used as the core of a new rubber ball, its skull wrapped in layers of latex. His life force, his very being, was thus recycled into the sacred object of the game, ensuring the cosmic cycle would continue. Here, in the heart of the jungle, sport and sacrifice were not separate ideas. They were two sides of the same ritual, a deadly game where the ultimate prize was not a trophy, but a direct role in the story of creation itself. While the Maya ball game channeled cosmic forces through physical struggle, the ancient Greeks sought divine guidance through a very different kind of transformation. High on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, in a temple complex that drew pilgrims from across the known world, sat the Oracle of Delphi. This was not a place for quiet prayer. It was the epicenter of a ritual that placed a single woman at the very heart of international politics, all through the power of intentional delirium. At the center of this ritual was the Pythia, a local woman chosen to serve as the god Apollo's mouthpiece. Her prophetic sessions were meticulously staged. After elaborate purification rites, she would descend into the inner sanctum of the temple and seat herself on a tall, three-legged stool placed directly over a crack in the earth. From this fissure, geological gases seeped upward. For centuries, this was thought to be mere legend, but modern geological surveys of the site have confirmed the presence of fault lines directly beneath the temple, releasing traces of ethylene, a sweet-smelling hydrocarbon gas known to have potent psychoactive effects. The Pythia would breathe in these intoxicating vapors, She would also chew leaves from the sacred laurel tree, an act believed to further connect her to Apollo. The combination was potent. The ethylene gas would induce a state of lightheadedness, disorientation, and euphoria, a trance that the ancients interpreted as a state of divine possession. In this frenzy, she would begin to speak. Her utterances were often wild, incoherent, and garbled. They were the raw, unfiltered sounds of a mind unmoored from reality. And this is where the ritual's second layer took over. Standing around her were teams of male priests, highly educated and politically astute. Their sacred duty was to listen to her ravings and translate them into elegant, often ambiguous hexameter verse. A city-state like Athens or Sparta, about to embark on a costly war, would present its question and receive a beautifully crafted but puzzling reply. The most famous example is the prophecy given to King Croesus of Lydia, who was told that if he attacked the Persians, he would destroy a great empire. He took this as a sign of victory, but the empire he destroyed was his own. This system placed immense power in the hands of the temple priests, who could shape the oracle's words to influence foreign policy, sanction new colonies, and amass incredible wealth. The logic that defies our modern mind is the core premise that truth, the ultimate truth about the future, could only be accessed through a state of controlled poisoning. In our world of data analytics and rational decision-making, the idea that a nation's fate should hinge on the translated ravings of an intoxicated priestess seems absurd. Yet for centuries, this was the supreme authority. It was a ritual that acknowledged a chaotic, unpredictable universe and trusted that the way to navigate it was not through pure reason, but by temporarily surrendering the mind to the gods. That belief in a soul's journey after death required a body that was not just preserved but fully functional. For the ancient Egyptians, the elaborate process of mummification was only the first step. A corpse, no matter how perfectly treated, was just an empty vessel. To truly live again in the field of reeds, the deceased needed to be able to breathe, to eat, to see, and to hear. This reanimation was the sole purpose of one of history's most meticulous rituals, the opening of the mouth ceremony. This was not a quiet prayer, but a complex piece of symbolic magic performed at the tomb's entrance. A specially appointed priest, acting as the sem-priest, would approach the mummy, which was often propped upright, or a statue meant to serve as a substitute body. He was armed with a collection of bizarre and sacred tools. The most important was a ritual adze, a blade often carved from meteoric iron, a material that had fallen from the heavens itself. He would use this tool to gently touch the mummy's mouth, its lips, again and again. Then he might switch to a forked blade or a ceremonial rod shaped like a snake, touching the eyes, the nose, and the ears in a precise, unchangeable sequence. But the physical actions were only half the ritual. With each touch, the priest recited powerful, specific incantations. He did not simply ask the gods for help, he commanded the senses to return. He spoke words to open the mouth for eating, to open the eyes for seeing, to open the ears for hearing. The logic was one of pure sympathetic magic. By physically mimicking the act of opening these features with celestial tools, and by speaking the reality into existence with spells, the priest was effectively rebooting the corpse's spiritual functions. The stakes for this ceremony could not have been higher. The Egyptians believed a person's soul was a composite of different parts. The ba was the personality, the part that could travel after death, but it had to be able to recognize and return to its body, the ket. If the mouth and eyes remained sealed, the ba would be lost, blind and mute in the afterlife. It would fail to recognize its own body, and this failure meant a second, final, and irreversible death, an annihilation far more terrifying than the first. So the entire extravagant Egyptian vision of eternity, with its feasts in the field of reeds and its reunions with loved ones, hinged entirely on the successful performance of this one strange ritual. It was a profound expression of their worldview, where death was a bureaucratic threshold and the correct paperwork, performed with the correct magical tools, was the only thing standing between a soul and oblivion. The Egyptian hope for a peaceful eternity required a body meticulously prepared for the afterlife, but a very different and deeply unsettling logic governed the sacred grounds of ancient Carthage. Here, in a sun-scorched precinct known as the Tophet, archaeologists have unearthed a mystery that remains one of history's most disturbing puzzles. Row upon row of small, stone urns were found, each containing the charred bones of infants, many just a few weeks old, carefully mixed with the cremated remains of young lambs and goats. The sheer scale is haunting, with some estimates suggesting the Carthaginian Tophet holds the remains of thousands of children. For centuries, the only explanation came from the Carthaginians' greatest enemies, the Romans and Greeks, whose historians wrote with grim detail about the rituals performed for the god Baal-Hamon. They described a bronze statue of the deity, its arms outstretched and its hands sloping downward toward a raging fire below. In times of extreme crisis such as plague, famine, or the threat of invasion, the city's most noble families were expected to make the ultimate offering. They would place their firstborn son into the statue's burning arms as a supreme act of appeasement. The accounts claim the ceremony was accompanied by the frantic beating of drums and the shrieking of flutes, a cacophony deliberately intended to drown out the cries of the grieving parents. This image is almost unbearable to contemplate, a state-sanctioned ritual where a parent's deepest love was pitted against their ultimate duty to the community and its gods. Yet, modern scholars fiercely debate what actually happened at the Tophet. Could any society regularly practice such a thing? An alternative theory suggests these were not victims of sacrifice, but a sacred cemetery for infants who died of natural causes. In an age of devastatingly high infant mortality, perhaps these children were symbolically offered to the gods in death, with the animal remains representing a substitute offering. The problem is that the bones show signs of being burned at extremely high temperatures, consistent with a sacrificial pyre, not a simple cremation after a natural death. So we are left standing before a chasm of understanding. Whether it was a regular practice or a desperate, last resort measure during existential threats, the Tophet forces us to confront a world where the bonds of family were not absolute. It presents a logic where the life of one child could be weighed against the survival of an entire civilization, and where the divine was believed to demand a price so horrifying that its memory had to be buried beneath the beating of drums. The dancing began with a single woman, and it never seemed to stop. In July of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophia stepped into the street and began to dance. There was no music, no celebration. Her movements were fervent, compulsive, and utterly relentless. She danced for days, her feet bleeding, her body weakening, but she could not cease. When authorities seized her and locked her in a cart, hoping to break the spell, it was already too late. Dozens of others had taken her place, their bodies moving with the same frantic, uncontrollable energy. Within a month, the streets were filled with a writhing mass of over 400 people, all dancing as if their lives depended on it. For many, it did. They danced until their hearts gave out, until they collapsed from strokes, or until sheer exhaustion simply ended them. The city council was baffled. Their physicians diagnosed it as a case of overheated blood, and in a logic-defying move, they prescribed more dancing as the cure. They built wooden stages in the town squares, hired professional musicians with pipes and drums to provide a rhythm, and even brought in strong men to keep the afflicted dancers upright. This official sanction only poured fuel on the fire, transforming a bizarre outbreak into a full-blown public spectacle of death. How could this happen? Modern science offers several chilling theories. One is mass psychogenic illness, a form of mass hysteria where psychological distress manifests as physical symptoms in a group. The people of Strasbourg were living through a period of extreme famine and disease. a pressure cooker of anxiety that may have needed a physical release. Another theory points to ergot poisoning, the same fungus suspected at Eleusis. Spoiled rye bread can produce a toxin that causes convulsions, spasms, and hallucinations, symptoms that could be misinterpreted as a frenzied dance. Or perhaps it was a collective trance state, a psychological fugue where the entire community, pushed beyond its limits, simply broke from reality in unison. This was not a ritual dictated by any priesthood or sacred text. It was a ceremony that erupted spontaneously from the despair of the populace, a collective physical mania that stands as one of history's most terrifying and perplexing examples of the human mind's power to destroy the body it commands. High on the frozen peaks of the Andes, the ice has slowly begun to surrender its secrets. The mummies found there are unlike any others, not ancient figures from a forgotten age, but children, their faces so perfectly preserved by the thin, cold air that they seem only to be sleeping. These are the victims of the Incan ritual known as capacocha, a practice that defies our every instinct about sacrifice. These children were not taken from their families in terror. They were chosen with immense care, selected from across the vast empire for their physical perfection and beauty. A child without a single blemish was considered pure, an offering worthy of the gods. For some, their final year of life was one of honor and privilege, their diets deliberately enriched to fatten them up, transforming them into the most beautiful and well-fed messengers imaginable. Their journey to the gods was an epic pilgrimage in itself. They were often taken from their home villages and brought to the Incan capital of Cuzco, a dizzying trip that could span hundreds of miles. There, in the heart of the empire, they were presented to the emperor himself, the Sopa Inca, in a great ceremony. They were then paraded back across the empire, this time towards the sacred mountain peaks, the Apus, which were seen as powerful gods that controlled weather and water. The final ascent was a brutal test of endurance for the accompanying priests, climbing to altitudes exceeding 20,000 feet, all while guiding these chosen children to their destiny. At the summit, in a small stone platform facing the sky, the final act of the ritual unfolded. The child was given a powerful sedative, chicha, a fermented corn beer, to ease their passage into the next world. They were then carefully arranged in a seated or fetal position, surrounded by exquisite offerings of gold, silver, and finely crafted dolls. The end was swift. Some were left to peacefully succumb to the deep cold and lack of oxygen, a sleep from which they would never wake. Others were killed by a single, precise blow to the head. The logic behind this act is both heartbreaking and profound. The Inca did not see this as a death, but as a transcendent promotion. These perfect children became literal messengers, their spirits sent to live with the powerful mountain gods and the deified ancestors. From that sacred, freezing throne, they would intercede on behalf of the entire empire, ensuring its stability, bringing fertile rains for the crops, and guaranteeing the favor of the gods for the Sopa Inca. They were frozen in a state of eternal purity, becoming permanent divine ambassadors in a celestial court, their physical preservation a sign that their sacred duty was still being fulfilled. The rigid gender roles of the Viking world were not just rules, they were the very fabric of a warrior's honor. Yet in the shadows, a form of magic thrived that deliberately unraveled that fabric. This was Seither, a potent form of Norse sorcery presided over by the goddess of love and war, Freyja. Seither was not about brute force, it was a subtle art of weaving and manipulating the threads of fate itself. Its practitioners could look into the future, curse an enemy's luck, cloud the minds of warriors before a battle, or even control the weather. But this immense power came with a profound social cost, one that strikes at the core of Viking identity. The practice of Seither was intrinsically linked to a concept known as ergi, a deeply insulting term that implied unmanliness, cowardice, and sexual perversion. Because this magic involved weaving destiny, a passive and receptive art, it was considered fundamentally feminine. For a man to practice Sather was to willingly step into a role that his culture viewed with suspicion and contempt. He was engaging in something seen as deceptive and unheroic, the very opposite of the straightforward courage celebrated in the sagas. This creates a stunning paradox at the heart of Norse mythology. The All-Father Odin, the chief of the gods, was a master of Sather. He famously hung upon the world tree for 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, to gain the hidden knowledge of the runes, and part of that knowledge was this forbidden magic. Yet the poems record that he was taunted for it, called ergi for engaging in a woman's art. Why would the pinnacle of Norse masculinity willingly embrace a practice that risked his honor? The answer lies in a cold, pragmatic logic. Odin's sole driving purpose was to gather all the knowledge and power in the cosmos to prevent the coming catastrophe of Ragnarok. If that meant transgressing every social norm, so be it. For him, and for the few human men who dared to practice Sather, the ability to see and shape fate was worth the price of being an outcast. They occupied a liminal space, both revered for their power and reviled for their methods. Their rituals defied logic by acknowledging that to truly command the invisible forces of the world, one first had to surrender the very identity that society held most sacred. The human head was a sacred object in the Celtic world, a living vessel of immense power long after its body had fallen. For the Celtic tribes of ancient Europe, the head was not merely the seat of the soul, it was the very container of a person's entire essence. All of their strength, their wisdom, their life force, and their very identity resided there. This belief forged a ritual practice that seems brutal to modern eyes, but was deeply spiritual to them, the sacred art of headhunting. A Celtic warrior did not take the head of just any enemy. This was an honor reserved for the most formidable and respected opponents defeated in battle. By claiming their head, the warrior was not just collecting a trophy, he was capturing and containing the very power of the man he had overcome. The process of preservation was meticulous. Historical accounts describe how these severed heads would be carefully treated with cedar oil, a substance that would prevent decay and keep the features recognizable for years. They were not hidden away. A warrior would proudly display these preserved heads in his home, often mounted on pillars or placed in special niches. They were his most prized possessions, a public testament to his valor and a private collection of accumulated power. But these heads were far more than grim decorations. The Celts believed that the spirit, the animating force of the person, remained active within the skull. These heads were thought to retain the ability to speak, to offer prophecies, and to sing songs of warning or guidance. A powerful chieftain's head could become a protective talisman for an entire community, its lingering spirit warding off evil. Archaeology provides chilling confirmation of this belief. At many Celtic sites, skulls have been found carefully placed in the lintels of doorways or in special wall niches, positioned as permanent guardian figures for a home or a fortress. Other finds include skulls deposited in sacred springs and bogs, offered to the gods of the otherworld. This ritualistic focus completely redefines the act of head hunting. It was not an act of simple brutality, but a form of spiritual capture. It represents a worldview where the boundaries between life and death were porous, and where the potent essence of a great person could be physically seized, preserved, and harnessed by the living. The Celtic warrior believed he could literally bring the strength of his enemies home with him, turning a moment of violent death into a lifelong source of protection and wisdom. A king's life was the ultimate political asset, and the ancient Mesopotamians developed a chillingly logical system to protect it. When court astrologers read the heavens and saw a dire prophecy, such as a solar eclipse that specifically foretold the monarch's death, they did not simply brace for impact. They activated an extraordinary emergency protocol known as the substitute king ritual. The solution was as ruthless as it was ingenious. To avert the prophesied doom, a stand-in would be publicly installed on the throne. This was not a noble or a warrior, but almost always a man from the absolute margins of society, a condemned criminal, a man with a mental disability, or sometimes even a lowly gardener. For 100 days, this substitute would live as the king. He was dressed in the royal robes, ate the finest foods, and performed all the ceremonial duties required of the crown. He was given a substitute queen as well, often a prostitute chosen for the role. Meanwhile, the true king would vanish. He went into hiding somewhere within the palace, and for the duration of the ritual, he was referred to only by the humiliating title of the farmer, a symbolic demotion meant to deceive the evil fate seeking him. The entire kingdom played along with this elaborate, deadly charade. The logic was one of perfect transference. The substitute, by living as the king, would act as a spiritual lightning rod, drawing the curse of the prophecy onto himself. He absorbed the evil fate, allowing it to settle upon his shoulders instead of the real monarchs. When the 100-day period concluded, the ritual reached its grim, preordained finale. The deception was over. The substitute king and his queen were not simply dismissed, they were ritually executed. Their deaths were the final, necessary step to complete the transference. By killing the substitutes, the evil omen was considered fulfilled and neutralized. The cosmos was satisfied, the political order was preserved, and the real king could emerge from hiding to reclaim his throne, his life saved by the ultimate sacrifice of a stranger. This was a world where a human life, especially one deemed expendable, was a tool of statecraft, a temporary shield against the unchangeable will of the gods. Hollywood has painted a picture of voodoo filled with zombies and pins in dolls, but the reality is a world away from those sensational myths. In Haiti, voodoo is a rich and sophisticated spiritual system, a complex tapestry of rituals designed not to harm but to connect. At its heart are the lower, powerful spirits who act as intermediaries between humanity and the distant, supreme creator God. These lower are not abstract ideas. They are distinct personalities with their own tastes, moods, and areas of influence, from healing and love to justice and agriculture. The entire purpose of a voodoo ceremony is to invite these spirits into the community, to bridge the gap between the human and the divine in the most direct way imaginable. The ritual begins with the beat of the drum. This is not background music, it is a sacred language. Each loa has its own rhythmic signature, a specific pattern of beats that acts as a spiritual telephone number, calling that particular spirit to the ceremony. As the drums pulse, the community joins in with specific songs and relentless, circular dancing. The energy builds, becoming a vortex of sound and motion that pulls the divine realm closer. This crescendo of devotion leads to the ritual's most profound moment, possession. A participant, often after years of training and devotion, may suddenly find their own consciousness gently pushed aside. They are being mounted by a loa. The spirit takes control of their body, using it as a vehicle to walk among the people. Their posture, voice, and mannerisms transform completely. The fierce warrior spirit Ogan might stride with a martial air, while the maternal Azuli Frida might weep tears of compassion. In this state, the possessed individual is no longer themselves, they are the loa. They will offer advice, settle disputes, diagnose illnesses, and deliver blessings, their words carrying the absolute authority of the divine. To prepare for this sacred encounter, the ceremonial space is meticulously arranged. On the ground, the priest or priestess will trace intricate, labyrinthine designs using cornmeal. These are vives, each one a unique symbolic signature for a specific loa. Drawing the vive is an act of invocation, a visual prayer that etches the spirit's presence into the very earth. And just as you would offer our honored guest food and drink, the loa are given gifts. This is where animal sacrifice, often a chicken or a goat, enters the practice. It is not an act of cruelty, but one of profound respect. The life force of the animal, its blood, is offered as sustenance to the loa, a vital energy that strengthens the spirit and acknowledges the bond between the human and divine world. This entire system defies Western logic because it rejects the idea of a distant, untouchable God. In Vodou, the divine is immanent, present, and eager to interact. The gods do not live in a far-off heaven. They arrive in the trembling body of a devotee, speaking with a human voice, offering guidance with human hands. It is a universe where the barrier between the spiritual and the physical is not a wall, but a permeable membrane, and through these elaborate, community-driven rituals, that membrane momentarily dissolves. High on the Tibetan plateau, where the ground is often frozen solid and trees are a rare sight, the very earth resists the rituals of death. Here, a funeral is not a private moment of interment, but a public offering to the sky. This is Jeta, the practice of sky burial, and it stands as one of the world's most profound expressions of compassion. The practical reasons are stark. With rocky soil making earth burial backbreaking labor and wood for cremation desperately scarce, the people of this region developed a solution that mirrors their harsh, beautiful environment. But the true heart of the ritual is not born of scarcity. It is born of a radical Buddhist philosophy regarding the body we leave behind. In this worldview, the physical form is a temporary vessel, an empty shell the moment the consciousness has departed. Clinging to that shell, preserving it in a box underground, is seen as an act of selfish attachment that can hinder the soul's journey. A decaying body is an impediment, a weight on the spirit. Jeta, which translates to giving alms to the birds, transforms this problem into the ultimate act of selfless charity. The ritual is performed by a Rogyapa, a body breaker, a figure who holds one of the most sacred and stigmatized roles in Tibetan society. On a remote, flat rock platform high in the mountains, the Rogyapa begins his work with a precise and solemn focus. Using a traditional cleaver, he dismembers the corpse in a specific, ritualized manner. He then systematically crushes the bones, mixing the powder with tsampa, a roasted barley flour, to create a kind of paste. As this grisly preparation concludes, the true participants of the ceremony arrive. Vultures, massive and patient, descend upon the platform, summoned by the Rogyapa's signals. They consume every last morsel of the remains. To witness this is to confront a funeral practice that completely inverts every Western instinct. We build sealed caskets and sturdy headstones to protect the body from nature. The Tibetan Buddhist offers their body directly to nature as its final, generous gift. The logic that defies our own is one of non-attachment and profound ecological harmony. The body, now devoid of its spirit, is seen as worthless. By giving it to the vultures, the deceased performs one last good deed, providing sustenance to other living beings. It is a swift, clean, and total return to the cycle of life, ensuring the soul is completely free to move on, unburdened by any physical remnant of its past existence. The logic of controlled chaos found its purest expression in the heart of Rome itself. Each February, the city paused for the Lupercalia, a festival so archaic and wild that even sophisticated Romans of the imperial era viewed it with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. Its origins were lost in the mist of time, a relic from the rustic, pre-Roman past that the empire could never quite bring itself to abolish. The ceremony began at the Lupercal, the sacred cave at the foot of the Palatine Hill where the legendary founders Romulus and Remus were said to have been nursed by the she-wolf. Here, the Luperci, a special order of priests, would gather to perform the opening sacrifices. The choice of animals was deliberate and symbolic. They sacrificed a goat for its rampant lust and a dog for its loyalty, two traits the ritual sought to harness. The blood of these animals was then smeared across the foreheads of young, aristocratic men. In a moment that must have shocked any visiting dignitary, these youths then stripped completely naked, embracing a state of primal innocence. They took strips of the freshly sacrificed goat's hide, fashioning them into whips. Then the real chaos began. The young men burst from the cave and began a frantic, laughing run around the boundaries of the ancient Palatine Hill. As they ran, they would lash out with their goat hide strips, striking any woman who came within reach. But this was not an act of aggression. Women would willingly line the streets, eagerly presenting their hands and backs to receive the stinging blows. They believed this ritual flagellation would cure infertility and ensure easy childbirth, a powerful incentive in a world where both were constant dangers. The logic here is a tangled web of sympathetic magic. The fertility of the goat, the purifying power of blood, and the life-giving force of the sacred boundary run all combined in a single, explosive ritual. It was a spectacle of sanctioned madness, where society's rules were temporarily inverted to reinforce the very foundations of that society, fertility and family. That this raw, visceral celebration of life and lust would be sanitized centuries later into the chocolate and flowers of Valentine's Day is one of history's greatest and most ironic transformations. Perhaps the most direct and intimate ritual of all was performed not on a grand stage, but on the very architecture of the human mind. Ancient surgeons, armed with nothing more than sharpened stones or crude hand drills, attempted to heal the spirit by opening a window to the brain. This was trepanation, and evidence of this brutal practice has been found on Neolithic skulls from South America to Europe and Africa. The procedure itself is almost unbearable to contemplate. A conscious patient would be held still while a healer scraped, cut, or drilled a hole directly into the living skull, completely without anesthesia or any understanding of germs. The sound of stone grinding on bone, the sheer force required to penetrate the cranial vault, the unimaginable pain, all point to a level of desperation and belief that transcends our modern medical understanding. So why would anyone submit to such an ordeal? The most straightforward theory is that it was a primitive form of emergency medicine. If a warrior suffered a fractured skull in battle, a trepanation could remove bone fragments and relieve pressure from a swollen brain, potentially saving their life. This practical explanation is supported by the most remarkable fact of all. Many of these ancient skulls show clear, smooth signs of new bone growth around the opening. These people did not just undergo the operation, they survived it, sometimes for many years afterward. But not every hole in the head was for a physical wound. The most logic-defying reason for trepanation was spiritual. Ancient cultures often viewed mental illness, epilepsy, or debilitating migraines not as medical conditions, but as evidence of a trapped evil spirit or a demonic presence inside the skull. The solution was as direct as it was terrifying: to physically create an opening, a door through which the malevolent entity could escape. This was a form of psychic surgery, an attempt to cure the soul by violating the body. The courage required for such an act, whether by the healer or the patient, is staggering. It represents a moment in human history where the lines between doctor and priest, between medicine and magic, were completely blurred. A severe headache could be interpreted as a spiritual battle, and the cure was to willingly allow someone to carve a permanent hole in your head. Bare skin meets the frigid night air in a spectacle of mass endurance. The Japanese Hadaka Matsuri, or Naked Festival, throws thousands of men into a state of controlled pandemonium, all for a chance to grasp a sliver of divine fortune. This is not a festival for the timid. In the dead of winter, participants clad only in a minimal fundoshi loincloth undergo intense purification, dousing themselves in cold water to cleanse their bodies and spirits for the trial ahead. The air is thick with anticipation and steam from their breath as they gather in a temple courtyard or public square, a sea of shivering humanity waiting for the signal. When it comes, the scene erupts into a primal struggle. The goal is to touch a chosen man, the Shin Otoko, believed to be a temporary vessel for the divine. In other versions, priests hurl sacred talismans called shingi into the surging crowd. What follows is a frenzied, chaotic scramble. Men are packed shoulder to shoulder, pushing, shoving, and climbing over one another in near-total darkness, illuminated only by flickering torches. The noise is deafening, a roar of collective effort and exertion. For the men caught in this crush, the experience is one of extreme physical discomfort, a test of pure endurance where the risk of injury is very real. The logic that defies our modern sensibilities is found in this very ordeal. The community believes that evil spirits are lazy and hate discomfort. By willingly embracing this mass suffering, the chaotic struggle, and the biting cold, the participants create an environment so inhospitable that malevolent forces are driven away. Their collective hardship becomes a form of spiritual cleansing for the entire town. Furthermore, the act of securing a talisman or touching the god-man transfers that purified luck to the individual, promising a year of good harvest, business prosperity, and personal happiness. It is a ritual that harnesses chaos to create order, using shared physical struggle as the ultimate prayer. A different kind of collision between worlds birthed rituals not from ancient texts but from the roar of 20th century warplanes. On remote islands across Melanesia, the Second World War arrived with the force of a thunderclap. Japanese and American military forces descended upon these isolated communities, transforming their tranquil shores into bustling hubs of a global conflict the islanders never knew existed. The outsiders built massive airstrips, unloaded mountains of crates filled with wondrous goods, and communicated through magical boxes. Then, as suddenly as they came, they vanished, leaving behind a few discarded trinkets and a profound, lingering mystery. Where did all the cargo go? The islanders, working entirely within their own spiritual logic, developed a breathtakingly creative answer. They concluded that the vast shipments of food, tools, and weapons were not manufactured by the foreigners, but were actually gifts intended for them, sent by their own ancestral spirits. The soldiers, they reasoned, had merely been the dishonest middlemen who intercepted the divine delivery. To summon the cargo back, the people began to meticulously reenact everything they had observed. They built intricate, life-sized replicas of control towers and runways from bamboo and vines. They fashioned headphones from wood and vine, sitting for hours in mock radio shacks calling out to the spirits. Men marched in precise drills with sticks carved to resemble rifles, believing the soldiers' discipline was a key part of the magic. They lit signal fires and flares along their handmade airstrips, desperate to guide the great metal birds back to their shores. These were not acts of foolishness. They were perfectly logical rituals born from a world view where material abundance did not come from factories but from the favor of the spirits. By perfectly imitating the foreigners' strange behaviors, they believed they could unlock the same powerful results. The cargo cults represent a heartbreaking moment of cultural fusion, where the logic of industrial might was interpreted, absorbed, and transformed into a profound act of faith, a prayer for prosperity whispered in the language of war. The logic of catharsis through expulsion found one of its most chilling expressions in ancient Greek city-states. When a plague ravaged the crops or a famine gripped the populace, the community would not turn inward to find the cause. Instead, they looked to their very edges, seeking a human vessel for their collective suffering. This was the ritual of the pharmakos, a word that gives us our term pharmacy, but its original meaning was far darker, signifying both poison and cure. The city, most famously Athens, would select its scapegoats. These were not criminals but outcasts chosen for their perceived otherness. Often they were the ugliest, the most impoverished, or those with physical disabilities, individuals already living on the margins of society. The ritual began with a grotesque irony. The chosen pharmakoi were first treated as honored guests. They were feasted lavishly at public expense, given fine foods and wines they could never normally afford. This banquet was not an act of kindness, but the first step in loading them with the community's sins, fattening them up both literally and symbolically for their fate. After the feast, the ceremony turned violent. The pharmakoi were paraded through the entire city, and as they moved, the citizens would beat them with fig branches and wild squill onions. The choice of materials was deeply symbolic, the fig representing fertility and the onion with its layered skin, symbolizing the layers of pollution being stripped away from the city. With each stinging blow, the people believed they were physically transferring their collective miasma, the spiritual stain of the crisis, onto the bodies of the scapegoats. The final act was one of brutal removal. The beaten and bruised individuals were then driven beyond the city walls, cast out into the wilderness to die from exposure and starvation, taking the city's corruption with them. In some older, more brutal accounts, the ritual ended even more definitively, with the pharmakoi being stoned to death by the community or burned on a pyre outside the boundaries of civilization. The dark genius of this ritual was its perverse social function. By uniting in the violent expulsion of the marginalized, the community reinforced its own cohesion. It defined the boundaries of belonging by demonstrating, in the most graphic terms, what lay outside them. In a world without scientific explanations for disaster, the pharmakos offered a tangible solution, a terrible but clear logic where the sacrifice of one or two could, in their minds, save the many. This final ritual brings us to the very heart of the Great Plains, where the sun dance stands as one of the most powerful and physically demanding ceremonies ever conceived by humanity. For tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Crow, this was not a performance but a profound communal prayer for the renewal of the entire world and the well-being of the people. The ceremony unfolded over many days, a grueling test of spirit and body that involved continuous dancing under the blazing sun, intense fasting, and a complete focus on the sacred. But the climax of this sacred ordeal was an act of self-sacrifice so intense it defies modern comprehension. After days of purification, certain dancers, having pledged themselves to the Great Spirit, would undergo the piercing ritual. A holy man would insert sharpened wooden skewers through the skin and muscle of the dancer's chest or back. These were not shallow pins, but deep piercings meant to bear significant weight. Ropes were then tied to the skewers, their other ends fastened to the top of a sacred central pole, or in some versions, to heavy buffalo skulls that the dancer would have to drag across the ground. The music and chanting would swell, and the dancer would begin to pull. With every step and every lean, the ropes would grow taut, pulling against the piercings in their flesh. The goal was not to endure the pain passively, but to actively struggle against it, to pull and strain until the skewers finally tore through the skin and broke free. This was the ultimate offering. The pain was not a punishment, but a gift. It was a prayer made physical, a sacrifice of one's own flesh offered for the healing of a sick relative, for the success of a hunt, or for the renewal of the entire tribe. The logic here is one of sacred reciprocity. Just as the Great Spirit was believed to have sacrificed parts of itself to create the world, so too would the dancer offer a piece of their own body. In that moment of extreme suffering and ultimate release, when the flesh finally gave way, the dancer was thought to transcend their physical self. They would enter a visionary state, receiving guidance, power, and a direct connection to the divine. The sun dance represents a truth that echoes through all these lost rituals, that humans have always believed the most profound connections to the cosmos are not found in comfort, but forged in the willing, sacred fire of personal sacrifice. From the self-inflicted trials of the sun dance to the cosmic bargaining of the Aztec Tezcatli, we have walked a path through 25 of history's most bewildering ceremonies. Each one, in its own startling way, defies the logic of our modern world. We have seen monks transform themselves into living statues, women dance themselves to death in the streets, and entire cities place their fate in the ravings of a poisoned priestess. The sheer diversity is staggering, from rituals of ecstatic liberation to acts of brutal, calculated sacrifice. Yet beneath this wild variety runs a powerful, unifying current. Across every continent and every era, humans have demonstrated a breathtaking willingness to endure extreme pain, to surrender their very bodies, and to perform acts that seem completely irrational to an outside observer. The drive behind these rituals was never mere madness. It was the deepest expression of the human spirit grappling with the great unknowns, the search for meaning in a chaotic universe, the desperate need to connect with the divine, and the profound responsibility to ensure the survival and prosperity of the community. These lost rituals force us to look beyond our own cultural lens and recognize that what we might dismiss as superstition was, for its participants, a direct line to the fundamental forces of existence. They remind us that the human capacity for belief is vast enough to justify almost any action, and that our ancestors would go to any length to feel a sense of control, purpose, and connection. So as we close this journey into the shadows of our past, we turn the question over to you. Which of these 25 rituals shocked or fascinated you the most? Was it the sokushinbutsu's grueling path to enlightenment, the Roman Lupercalia's chaotic run, or the heartbreaking logic of the Incan capacacha? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear which mystery resonated with you. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of history's strangest lost rituals. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, be sure to subscribe for more adventures into the deepest mysteries of our past.